Man just confessed to a murder he didn't commit, and somehow, that wasn't even the worst decision made that night. Welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first time here, this is where we break down the Chi Season 8, Episode 10 piece by piece. No fluff, just the truth about what these characters just did to themselves. Let's start with the obvious question, because I know it's on everybody's mind right now. Why would anyone confess to a murder when the police don't even have a body? That's not bravery. That's not loyalty. That's just handing law enforcement a case they couldn't build on their own. And that's exactly what happened in this episode, and it's why we're here today, because Reg just did something that, on paper, looks noble, but when you actually sit with it for more than 5 minutes, it falls apart. Here's the situation as it stood before any of this went down. Detective Nocuts had nothing. Not a shred of physical evidence tying anyone to Nuck's murder. No body. No murder weapon. No confirmed timeline. What she did have was a second-hand account, a recording of Zay describing what he claims he witnessed. That's it. That's the entire foundation her case was built on. And if you know anything about how the justice system actually works, you know that a second-hand audio clip describing an alleged event is not evidence of guilt. It might be enough to open an investigation. It is nowhere close to enough to secure a conviction. So when Tiffany got arrested, her instinct was the correct one. She told Victor to take their son and call her lawyer. That's the move. That's what any competent legal team would tell you to do the second police show up, without a body or a weapon. Fight it in the room where the rules actually protect you, which is the courtroom, not the interrogation room. But instead of following through on that instinct, Victor made a choice that changed the entire trajectory of the storyline, and it's worth slowing down here, because the show wants you to feel the weight of family loyalty in this moment, and on the surface, it works. But underneath that emotional beat is a decision that makes almost no logical sense once you strip away the sentiment. Earlier in the episode, we got a quiet scene between Victor, Reg, and Jake, talking about their mother and the code she raised them on, the idea that family protects family no matter the cost. It's a powerful piece of writing, honestly. It gives weight to everything that follows. But powerful writing and smart decision-making are two very different things, and this is where the show starts asking its characters to choose emotion over logic, which, to be fair, is very true to how real people behave under pressure. Grief and panic don't exactly lead to clear thinking. Still, as viewers, we're allowed to look at this and say, this was avoidable. Victor stepping forward to take responsibility wasn't just risky, it was unnecessary. Detective Nocuts' entire case at that point hinged on hearsay. A recorded statement from Zay claiming Nuck admitted to killing Rob is not proof that Nuck did it, and it is absolutely not proof of who killed Nuck. Anyone with basic knowledge of how courts evaluate evidence would tell you that statement alone would likely get thrown out or, at minimum, heavily challenged before it ever reached a jury. There was no chain of custody, no forensic tie, no corroborating witness. Just one person's account of what another person allegedly said. That's the kind of evidence that gets picked apart in the first 10 minutes of a cross-examination. And this is where Reg enters the picture, and where things get genuinely tragic, because Reg didn't do this out of guilt over anything he actually did. He did it because of what his brother was about to throw away. He watched Victor step toward a confession, and rather than let that happen, he intervened, choosing to carry the weight himself. On an emotional level, it's one of the more affecting choices in the season because Reg had, by most measures, a path towards something better. He wasn't tied to Nuck's murder in any provable way. His other entanglements, the tension with Alicia, the situation with that red coat Candace had been holding on to, none of that had surfaced as a real threat yet. He had room to walk away clean. Instead, he stepped directly into the fire for a brother who, frankly, put himself there first. And that's the part of this episode that deserves more scrutiny than it's gotten. Victor wasn't protecting Tiffany by staying quiet and letting the legal process play out the way it's designed to. He was protecting her by manufacturing a confession that police didn't have the evidence to justify pursuing in the first place. Think about what that means. If Victor had just done nothing, if he had simply followed Tiffany's instructions and let her lawyer handle it, there's a real chance this entire storyline resolves without anyone going to prison. The lack of a body alone should have been enough to keep this case from moving forward with any real force. Instead, panic took over, and panic led to a confession that didn't just implicate Victor. It opened the door for Reg to insert himself into a crime scene that investigators hadn't even confirmed existed yet. There's also something worth sitting with here about what the season has been building toward with Victor specifically. This isn't a character who's new to high-stakes legal trouble. Just a handful of episodes ago, he walked away from a murder charge, and it took serious effort, serious help from people like Rashad, and no small amount of luck for that to happen. You'd think surviving something like that would make a person more careful, not less. Instead, here he is again, standing in the middle of a situation with far less leverage than before, and somehow choosing an even riskier path. That's the part that should genuinely worry fans of this character, because it suggests a pattern, not an isolated lapse in judgment. So, where does that leave us heading into the back half of this episode? With a confession on the books, a body location revealed to police, and a family that just handed law enforcement the exact ammunition they didn't have 20 minutes earlier. And the question we have to ask now isn't just whether Reg can survive what's coming. It's whether any of this was ever necessary to begin with. Because if the evidence truly wasn't there and multiple signs point to it not being there, then everything that unfolds from this point forward was completely preventable. Now, let's talk about the body, because this is where the story takes its most self-destructive turn, and it's the detail that should have every fan of this show shaking their head. Once Reg made the decision to step in and take responsibility, the smart move, the only move that actually made sense, would have been to say as little as possible. Confessing without evidence is bad enough. But then giving investigators the exact location of Nocuts' remains? That's not protecting anyone. That's building the prosecution's case for them, brick by brick, with your own hands. Think about what a confession without a body actually means in a legal sense. Prosecutors need what's called corpus delicti, basically, proof that a crime actually occurred, not just someone's word that it did. Without a body, without forensic evidence, a confession alone can be shaky ground to build a murder case on, especially if that confession later gets recanted or challenged. Defense attorneys have gotten confessions thrown out before under far less scrutiny than this situation would invite. There were no witnesses to the murder itself. There was no weapon recovered. There was nothing physically tying Reg, or Victor for that matter, to the actual killing. All they had before this episode was word of mouth wrapped in more word of mouth. That's an incredibly weak foundation for any prosecutor to stand on, and any competent lawyer walks into that situation with real leverage. But the moment that body location left Reg's mouth, all of that leverage disappeared. Suddenly, investigators aren't relying on a shaky second-hand account anymore. They have a physical crime scene. They have forensic timelines to build from. They have a location that only someone with direct knowledge of the murder could have provided, which, in the eyes of a jury, reads as damning corroboration. It transforms a case that a defense attorney could have picked apart in an afternoon into a case with real teeth. And the tragic irony here is that Reg wasn't even the one who needed to protect that information. He wasn't the one who moved the body in the first place. That was Victor. Which means Reg walked into a legal nightmare to shield a brother who had already put himself in a far more precarious position than Reg realized. And that raises an uncomfortable point that the show hasn't fully addressed yet, but probably will before the season wraps. If investigators ever learn the full picture, that Victor helped move the body, that Tiffany was the one who actually dropped Noc off, that there's an entire chain of people involved beyond just the person now sitting in a cell claiming responsibility, this whole story falls apart in a different way. Reg's confession doesn't hold up once the real details surface, because a confession has to match the physical evidence for it to stick in court. If forensic analysis reveals details about how the body was moved, when it was moved, or by whom, in ways that don't line up with what Reg has claimed, that opens the door for the whole case to unravel, possibly in a way that puts Reg in an even worse position, not because he's guilty, but because his story won't hold together under real scrutiny. There's also an emotional layer here that's worth sitting with, because this isn't just a legal misstep, it's a family tearing itself apart in real time over a decision that never had to happen. Reg had a version of this season where he comes out relatively unscathed. He wasn't the target of Nocuts' investigation. He wasn't the one Bari was building a case against. His name barely came up until he chose to insert it into the conversation. That's what makes this so hard to watch. He had an exit ramp, and he drove past it on purpose because of a promise made to his mother, a promise about loyalty that his brother invoked at exactly the wrong moment for exactly the wrong reason. And let's be honest about something else, because it needs to be said plainly. Tiffany is not someone who has shown Victor the kind of loyalty he's now sacrificing his brother's future to protect. This is a relationship built on complicated history, unresolved feelings, and a whole lot of one-sided effort from Victor's side. He's been chasing something with her for a long stretch of the season, and the show has never really suggested that Tiffany feels the same intensity back. Which makes this moment sting even more, because Victor wasn't just willing to throw away his own freedom for her, he was willing to let his brother do it instead. That's not romantic sacrifice. That's a chain reaction of bad decisions, each one justified by the last, until the person who ends up paying the highest price is the one person in this entire situation who arguably did the least wrong. So, as we head toward the final stretch of the season, the picture becomes painfully clear. Detective Nocuts walked into this situation with almost nothing solid to work with, a single recorded statement and a theory. And instead of forcing her to prove that theory in a courtroom, where it likely wouldn't have survived serious challenge, the Taylor family handed her everything she needed. A confession, a body, a location, the exact pieces of a case that didn't exist 20 minutes earlier. And now the question isn't whether the police did their job well. It's whether this family ever needed to hand them the answers in the first place. So now we arrive at the part of the story that's hardest to sit with, because this isn't just about legal strategy anymore. This is about what happens to a family after loyalty gets weaponized against its own better judgment. Reg is sitting in a cell right now for a crime he didn't commit, carrying the weight of a confession that never should have needed to happen, all because his brother panicked in a moment that called for patience instead. And based on what the preview for the next episode is showing us, Reg is about to feel the full emotional cost of that decision. We're going to watch him break down under the reality of what he's actually signed up for, and it's going to be hard to watch, because the show has spent this entire season making us care about him. Here's the thing that makes this hit even harder. Reg had already proven he could survive this show without a murder charge attached to his name. Whatever tension existed with Alicia, whatever history was tied to that red coat Candace held onto, none of it had turned into anything prosecutable. He was, by every indication the show gave us, someone who might actually walk away from this season with his freedom intact. That's rare on the show. Most characters who get this kind of clean runway end up sabotaging it somehow, and unfortunately, Reg's sabotage came from the outside, from a brother who couldn't sit still long enough to let the truth, or the lack of evidence, work in the family's favor. And that's really the tragedy underneath all of this. Victor's instinct wasn't malicious. It came from a place of guilt, and maybe even love, misguided as it was. He looked at Tiffany and baby Rob and felt like he owed them something immediate, something dramatic, a grand gesture that would prove his loyalty once and for all. But grand gestures don't hold up in a courtroom, and they definitely don't hold up when the person making them hasn't thought through what happens next. Because the moment Victor opened his mouth, he didn't just put himself at risk. He set off a chain reaction that pulled his brother directly into the blast radius, and there was nothing noble about the outcome, only consequences that neither of them fully understood until it was too late to take back. What makes this season different from earlier ones is how avoidable this all feels in hindsight. This wasn't a case where the family got caught because investigators finally found undeniable proof. This was a case where the family caught themselves, piece by piece, decision by decision, until they built an airtight case against themselves that law enforcement couldn't have assembled on their own. Detective Nocuts didn't outsmart the Taylor brothers. They outsmarted themselves right into a cell, and that's a much harder pill to swallow than simply losing to good police work. There's no satisfaction in watching a family destroy itself over decisions that panic dressed up as loyalty. And that brings us to where this story leaves us as we head into the final episode of the season. Reg is going to have to live with a confession that was never his to make. Victor is going to have to live with the knowledge that his brother is paying a price that should have been his alone to bear, if anyone had to bear it at all. Tiffany, the one person who actually understood how to handle this situation, watching Victor and Reg spiral around a case that could have collapsed under its own lack of evidence, and instead the men in her life talked themselves into a conviction. There's something quietly devastating about that, about watching someone with the clearest head in the room get overruled by panic and misplaced heroism. At the end of the day, this isn't a story about who killed Nuck. Not really. It's a story about how quickly a family can unravel when loyalty stops being a source of strength and starts being a liability, when protecting each other means protecting each other from consequences that were never truly there to begin with. The Taylor brothers didn't get taken down by Detective Tookant. They got taken down by a promise made to their mother, twisted into a decision that neither of them was equipped to make wisely in the moment it mattered most. And that's the kind of ending that sticks with you, not because it's shocking, but because it feels so painfully human, so easy to see coming, and so impossible for the people living it to stop in time. So that's where we leave things heading into the final episode of The Cheese Season 8. Reg behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Victor left to sit with what his loyalty actually cost. And a case that never should have made it this far, now sitting on the desk of a detective who got handed a confession she barely had to work for. If you've been riding with this story as closely as I have, let me know down in the comments what you think happens next.